Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Eric Gould. I'm one of the MAPERS board members, and I also chair the City of Farmington Hills Employee Retirement System. Today's topic is certainly timely. We wrestled with this issue recently. A copy of today's presentation can be found on the events page of the MAPERS website, and a link to the handouts was also included in this morning's reminder email. Today's webinar is sponsored and presented by Foster & Foster. Presenting today are Jason Franken and Sandy Rodwin. Jason has 25 years of experience consulting employers on a wide range of pension and post-retirement welfare plan issues. He's a frequent speaker at retirement conferences across the country. He's worked with retirement programs ranging in size from small and large public plans to large Taft-Hartley and Fortune 500 plans. Jason is a fellow of the Society of Actuaries, a member of the American Academy of Actuaries, and is an enrolled actuary per ERISA. He earned his BS degree in actuarial science from the University of Iowa, the home of the Hawkeyes. Sandy is a familiar face to MAPERS. And she's provided actuarial and consulting services to public employee and retirement programs for over 30 years. She specializes in designing and funding of retirement programs, including post-retirement health insurance, and analysis of retirement objectives, and income adequacy and education regarding retirement issues. She has a Master of Actuarial Science degree from the University of Michigan and a Bachelor of Arts degree with a major in mathematics from the University of Detroit. She's a member of the American Academy of Actuaries and a fellow of the Conference of Consulting Actuaries. And to top it all off, she's a certified financial planner. Please submit any questions that you have for our speakers using the Q&A button located in the Zoom app. And questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Welcome, Jason and Sandy.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.
For those, I'm sure many of you know, but Sandy and her firm joined Foster & Foster at the end of 2020. And so as we, have been working through the transition, the single biggest question that has come up over the last almost 5 months now. Hard to believe it's been 5 months into 21 already, but the single biggest question that's come up has been around the annuity withdrawal interest rate. There's reasons for that. The PBGC stopped issuing the rate that had been used by many funds. And so, we thought that this would be a great topic, and timely to discuss today during our webinar. The interesting thing that I've noticed over the last few weeks dealing with this is Sandy has a great wealth of knowledge when it comes to this subject. She shared with me some memos that she provided to her clients, back when this was being implemented, and so the interest rates that, there's a table in one of her memos that she prepared that is very similar to what you'll see here in our presentation today. And the interest rates in that table were 7%, 8%, 10%, and 12%. And so those rates are much different than where we are today. So I'm going to turn it over to Sandy to sort of get things started, to talk about what this benefit is and sort of how it got its start here with plans in Michigan. So go ahead, Sandy.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Well, in most of the pension plans across the country and in Michigan in particular, the design is similar in that the members contribute a portion of their salary each year to fund their benefit, and that's different than in the private sector in many ways. Act 345 retirement systems, for example, the employees contribute generally 2%, unless there's a negotiated change that's different than that statute. But often the contribution rates range from 3 to 6% of pay. And that amount is accumulated in the member's account in the retirement system, and with the interest. And at the time that they retire, that's when we'll be talking about what is there a benefit provided at the time they retire where they can take that those contributions out. Benefits typically, as you know, received by members in retirement are defined by the plan document, the ordinance, and especially ultimately through collective bargaining. And I remember back in the 1980s when many Michigan pension funds started to add another form of payment, which allows members to take their member contributions plus their interest as a lump sum at retirement. And that's what we call annuity withdrawal. It's a little bit different than, again, what would be offered in the private sector. It's something more common in public employee plans. And in Michigan now, I would say the majority of plans do allow members to take out their contributions as a lump sum at retirement as an option. So the related question to all of this is, so what happens when somebody does elect to take this option? How is it reflected? How much money do they actually get back? And what happens? Well, what happens is that there will be a reduction in their pension to reflect the fact that if they take the money out of the retirement system, they will have a reduced benefit, and the actuarial reduction is calculated based on a specific interest rate and mortality table. And we'll be talking at a pretty great length about, in particular, the interest rate, but also the mortality table. Those are the two key assumptions that are used to make sure, or to maybe try to create an actuarial equivalent. But as you'll see in Jason's presentation, as he goes on, the intricacies of this and the wide variety in the assumptions that are used to make these calculations. And usually the basis for all this is negotiated between unions and the municipality. Ultimately, the governing body of the retirement of the city will often make the final decision. And what happens is that the reduction in the benefit to the benefit may be not cost neutral, or it may be cost neutral. And when I say cost neutral, that means that there's no added cost to the retirement system because a member elects to pull out their contributions and or interest at retirement. If it's cost neutral, then there's no increase in the cost for the retirement system. But as you'll see, as Jason continues with this, that is can be a very difficult thing to determine the cost neutrality and to make it work over the long period of time. For an example, when you have interest rates varying from in the 1980s to from as high as 11-12% down to 0% now, or just a little bit more than 0%, it's made annuity withdrawal a pretty complicated benefit to value, and to make sure that there's not for the municipality to make sure that there's not a significant additional cost generated, or if there is an additional cost, that they know that that is what is going to happen. So with that, I will turn it over to Jason, and he can go on with the assumptions, the mortality and the interest assumption, and we'll go from there.
Okay, well, thanks, Sandy. So as I was preparing this presentation, as the title may suggest, we were spending all of our time on the interest rate. But last week I received a question from one of our clients about the mortality table, and so it was a good. It is worth discussing, so I added it to our presentation. But recently we updated the mortality table for valuation purposes for one of our clients. We did an experience study we made changes to several assumptions, and the mortality table, we adopted the new, the PUB 2010, the public safety table in this case, because that's the most recent table that's up to date. And the board asked, well, are we using the same assumption when we convert our benefits to the optional forms, including the joint survivor options and the annuity withdrawal reduction that's calculated? And so there really are two separate assumptions, one for your VAL and one for benefit calculation purposes. In fact, the mortality assumption that is used in calculating your optional forms of benefit actually must be different than what you use in your valuation. And it's required to be different is because of a Supreme Court ruling that says gender-specific mortality tables cannot be used when converting benefits to optional forms. And so we could use the same PUB 2010 table for benefit calculation purposes, but we would have to use a variation of that table. We could use male mortality, for example. We could use female mortality, but we would have to use that mortality regardless of the actual gender of the member that is involved in the calculation. And it's just to eliminate discrimination. So whether you're male or female, if you're age 55, you're going to get the same benefit. If we use gender-specific mortality, a man who is age 55 is going to get a different amount than a woman who is age 55. And really, that's why we can't use the same mortality table. So some plans, may use completely different tables, and I think a lot of places do. For example, you might use PUB 2010 tables in your actuarial evaluation, but you could use the 84 UP84 table, which is a unisex table, and no adjustment is needed to get to the same mortality rates, when converting your benefits. This mortality assumption, when you're talking about the benefit calculations, those are changed much less frequently than the assumption in your valuation. And there's a few reasons for that. One, it's difficult to constantly be updating your administration in your administrative system. In the private sector, there are anti-cutback rules where once you have a benefit, it can't be reduced. And so if I did a calculation for a member and his benefit 50 J&S benefit is $1,000 per month, and then I change my basis, my mortality table, it could become $990 per month, and the member could argue, hey, you just cut my benefit by changing the mortality table. So that's one of the reasons, probably one of the main reasons why this table isn't changed more often. In the public sector, you don't necessarily have all of the same rules that private sector plans do, so you could potentially make those changes, but it doesn't have a huge impact in the calculation. And the reason is because you're really not comparing. You're comparing how a single life compares to a joint life, and you're not comparing one mortality table to a different mortality table. So that's generally why the mortality table doesn't have a huge, nearly as big of an impact on benefit calculations as it would if you were doing an actuarial evaluation. So with that, I'm going to change, to the interest rate, and that's by far the more important assumption that we're going to be looking at today. And similar to your mortality assumption, this rate can be different, and in most cases is different than what people are using in their valuation, their actuarial valuation. Most of the plans that I've dealt with, you have used the PBGC rate, and that is not the rate that they're using in their actuarial evaluation. So again, they can be different. Lump sums And that's really what we're talking about here with the annuity withdrawal, is you're taking a lump sum of a portion of your benefit. In the private sector, there are requirements based on how those lump sums are calculated. There's a specific mortality table, there's a specific interest rate, and those interest rates are generally much lower than what we would use for the ongoing actuarial assumption. And it's a risk-free type rate. What could what are treasuries, for example? There's no real risk involved with investing in treasuries. So let's take that interest rate, and it's really viewed as settling the liabilities. Okay, a pension plan, if you want to sell your liabilities to an insurance company, they're going to charge you this based on this kind of rate. So your liability for your pension plan might be $100 million in your actuarial evaluation, but if you wanted to close your pension plan, offload it to an insurance company, well, they're not going to charge you $100 million, which is based on 7%. They're going to charge you based on the risk-free rate, which might be 3.5. So that 100 million might become 200 million. That's why most of the private sector plans that have closed have not gone that route yet, is because interest rates are too low, and they would have to come out of pocket for a lot more money because of the difference in the interest rate. So when we're thinking about these payments, keep that in mind. That typically these payments are calculated using much lower interest rates than what we would use on an ongoing actuarial valuation basis. I guess I've already talked about a little bit about the private sector, but the interest rate that they're required to use is released in what's called IRS Code Section 417E, and they use a slightly more complicated approach, a yield curve approach. So they're not just using one rate; they're using multiple rates depending on when the cash flow occurs. But currently, if a lump sum was being calculated for a 50-year-old, they would be using, the private sector plans would be required to use a rate of, what's around 3.25% currently. There's much more flexibility. Those same 417E provisions don't apply to your plan, so you are able to use a rate that you choose. So when you use a lower rate, it produces a payment that's larger than what the value of your benefit is in your actuarial valuation. The liabilities are such that as you lower the interest rate, the liability goes up. And if you have an ongoing valuation where the liability is calculated at 7%, that liability is going to be less than the amount that would act as a lump sum that's being calculated at 3 in a quarter percent. One thing that the actuaries should be doing is we should reflect these payments in our valuations. If we know that 25% of a person's payment or their obligation is going to be paid immediately upon retirement, our actuarial valuation should reflect that. We should have assumptions on how many people take this option. And from what I've seen, it's basically 100% of the people take it when it's available. So the actuarial valuation should reflect it. And if it doesn't reflect it, then, as we'll see in a little bit, there can be actuarial losses that arise because of that difference in the liability calculation versus the payment being made at different interest rates. So what have most plans been using in Michigan to value this annuity withdrawal reduction? And so most plans that I've seen are using the PBGC 4022 immediate lump sum rate to determine the term reduction is going to be. These rates were designed to determine lump sum amounts in plan terminations. So that's not really what we're doing here. We're not doing a plan termination we're just calculating a reduction to your benefit. So it, how it was selected, it's still a little bit of a mystery to me, but I think the big reason was that the PBGC rates back in the 80s, when these benefits were being implemented, were really consistent with the long-term rates of return that were being used in the actuarial valuations. So it was more of a apples to apples comparison. This rate was at 8-9%. That's where the investment return assumptions were. So I think that's how it was selected. But a little bit more about the PBGC. That PBGC stands for the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. This is like the FDIC of private pension plans. If an employer, a private employer, a Fortune 500 company has a pension plan and they go out of business and can't meet their obligations, well, the PBGC steps in and makes sure that the participants receive their pension payments. Usually it's not a dollar for dollar. Usually there can be reductions to the benefit, but they're making sure that the participants don't lose all of their pension benefit that they've worked so hard for during their careers. The PBGC does not insure public pension plans. So again, there's a little bit of a disconnect from, okay, the PBGC rate, it really has nothing to do with the public sector, but that is the rate that most plans use. The reason that this is so timely right now is because beginning in 2021, the PBGC stopped publishing this rate. So they basically came out early last fall and said, starting in 2021, we are no longer going to be publishing this rate. And so boards have been scrambling to figure out, well, what do we do now? We used to just go look up this rate. That's what we used. We used that for a year at a time in most cases. And, it was really easy. Now that rate is no longer available. How are we going to do these calculations going forward? Well, I guess from a high level view, we need to, meaning the pension fund needs to come up, find a new rate, a replacement rate that they're going to use in determining the benefit calculations. Ultimately, though, as Sandy mentioned, this is not something that they really have any control over. It's negotiated between the municipality and the unions, and so they just administer whatever is being provided by those negotiating parties. But I think it is important that the pension board helps educate all of the people, that all of the stakeholders in this decision, rather than just saying, hey, just pick a rate. Let's understand it and come up with something that's mutually agreeable for everybody. This rate, it has been historically low over the last several years. In fact, over the last 2 years, it's been less than 1%. Sandy mentioned that in the 80s, when this rate was being selected, it could have been as high as 11. It was as high as 11% in 1982, and at that point, that was very similar to the long-term assumption that was being used by these funds. So there wasn't a whole lot of discussion that was needed at that time. We're the rates at 9%. We're assuming 9%. Let's just go with it, right? There's no really decision that need to be made. As time has advanced, this rate has been 0% or close to it for the last couple of years. The circumstances are a little bit different. So that's really the point of the session today, is to help educate everybody so you understand, how the impact that your decision is going to have on your plan and your members over the long term. The next thing I want to do is sort of walk through an example. And this is one that we prepared for one of our clients. We're looking at a member who's retiring at age I think they had a 25 and out. Starting at age 48, he's looking to retire. His monthly benefit without taking an annuity withdrawal is $5,381. The member contributions are just over 114,000. In our valuation, we're using a long-term assumption of 7.75%, but the PBGC rate, as I previously mentioned, is at 0%. So there is a pretty big difference in our valuation rate versus the PBGC interest rate. So when we did the calculation, if the member does not elect the annuity withdrawal at retirement, they're going to receive that monthly single life annuity of $5,381. When we take the present value of that calculation at our 7.75%, the value of the benefit for that member is almost $809,000. So they're going to, that's in today's dollars, the value of their benefit is $809,000. Well, what happens if that member elects the annuity withdrawal? Well, the first thing that happens is they get that check, that lump sum check, which is about 12.5% or so, a little more of their total benefit. The $114,000, they get that check immediately. Using the 0% interest rate that we have for the PBGC rate, the monthly reduction is $262. So this member would get the $114,000 immediately. Then they would continue to receive a monthly single life annuity benefit of $5,119. When we do that present value, that same present value calculation, that $114,000 now, since it's being paid today, that really increases the value of our benefit. And when we do that present value calculation now, you'll see that the amount, the present value increases from $808,000 to $883,000. So there is a $75,000 increase to the value of the member's benefits by electing that option. So it shouldn't surprise anybody that all of the members are taking this option. Essentially they're increasing the value of their benefit, in this case, pretty dramatically overnight. And so that's, like I said, an example of what it looks like, at the 0%. So this increase, I'll call it a subsidy, right? The benefit has increased by the member electing this option. And there's several things that, if you dig into it a little more, that you would need to consider. I mean, there could be anti-selection. What I mean by that is anyone, who's going to benefit the most from it is going to take this. And when you have a 0% interest rate, everybody will benefit, pretty substantially. And so that's why you would see, we're seeing so many people elected. Other things that can also play into it is if someone's not in good health, it's a way to get a huge chunk of their benefit that they might not be entitled to, or their beneficiaries might not be entitled to if they were, let's just say if they retired and then died within a year or two. So there is some anti-selection that happens because of this subsidy that's being provided by, and it's not something that is, it's not a decision that anyone's really making. It's subsidy really that's being provided by the difference in the interest rates. And so to us, that's what is important for everybody to understand. The impact on your actuarial evaluation, and I touched on this a little bit ago, if you're accurately reflecting the number of people who are taking the benefit, and you have appropriate assumptions on the interest rates that are being used, well, your actuarial evaluation should include this. So from what I'll call a cost perspective or a contribution perspective, people taking this option might not impact your contribution requirement at all because it's built in to your actuarial evaluations. If it's not appropriately reflected in your valuation, then it's going to lead to actuarial losses. And when you have actuarial losses, it's going to lead to an increase in your contribution requirement. So this is, like I said, I think an important assumption that you need to have with your actuary is, okay, are we appropriately reflecting the annuity withdrawal in our valuation? What percentage of the people are we assuming take this? What interest rate is being used? Because like I said, from a contribution perspective, this might be neutral. It might be something that's already being considered. But since it is a fairly substantial subsidy that's being provided to the members, you know, it's something that you really need to think about it and make sure that it's being captured in your valuation. So we looked at the sort of the 0% scenario, and that's where most people are because of the current PBGC rate. Well, what we've shown on this slide demonstrates a variety of different interest rates, and you'll see that the 0% row, that's this example we've just looked at. If we were to increase our annuity withdrawal rate from 0% to 0.5%, you'll notice that the monthly reduction goes up, right? You've increased your interest rate, and the way the calculation works, when you increase your interest rate, you actually increase the monthly reduction. In this case, it's a modest $26 per month, but going forward, rather than receiving $5,119, the member would receive $5,093. The present value of the benefit goes down a little bit. And so there's a little less subsidy that's being provided, about $4,000 less by increasing our interest rate by 50 basis points. If we increase it another 50, well, it's the similar outcome, a bigger reduction to the monthly benefit and a lower present value and a slightly smaller subsidy. I've also shown 2%, 3.5%. I thought was an interesting one to show, just because that's sort of where a lot of people are from their payroll growth perspective. It does produce a pretty significantly higher reduction to the monthly benefit from where we are today, $471 versus $262, and has reduced the subsidy from $75,000 to $43,000. If we go all the way to our 7.75% and remember, sorry, not 3/4, 7.35% assumption, you'll see that the monthly reduction goes from $262 where we are today, $52 at that current rate. So they're getting, much less on a monthly basis going forward. The present value, basically eliminates the entire subsidy. You'll notice that there's a little bit of a difference there, 1,261. That's really attributable to the slight difference in mortality tables that we're using. So I spent a couple minutes on mortality tables at the beginning of this presentation. It was only a couple minutes because, as you can see, it's only a 12, there's not a huge difference here. It's really driven by the interest rate. So I've spent a lot of time talking about the subsidy, but let's think about this from the member's perspective. This is a huge, going from 0 to 7.75% has a huge impact on them as well. So the benefit is, $500 per month larger at 7.35%. So we also need to consider, okay, how is this going to affect the members? If a member's age 20, 25, they're not planning for this. But for those people near retirement, any change to the interest rate could have a pretty big impact on the amount that they're going to receive on a monthly basis going forward. Okay, most of this, I've talked about already, but like I said, I think it's important to educate everybody, to make sure that you understand that this rate it's not what I would call cost neutral. if it's not being valued in the appropriately in the valuation. There will be actuarial losses. And if that is something that is an issue, then I think that needs to be considered. We also need to make sure that the members are being considered when we're discussing this. And I guess the question that comes up is, do we need to negotiate a new rate? On the next page, I'll spend a few minutes talking about the replacement interest rate. So when the PBGC announced that they were no longer going to be publishing this rate, they did propose methodology for a replacement rate. That replacement rate was effectively mimicking the rate that they have been publishing in the past. I will say that the new approach is a little bit convoluted. In order to get the rate that you're going to use, you have to wait for the IRS to publish a notice. Once you have that notice, you have to go to a yield curve that has 200 different interest rates in it, and you have to look up the interest rate that is exactly 12 years. So you look up the 12-year interest rate. Once you have that 12-year interest rate, you go to another table that's part of the PBGC 4022, and it's an appendix to it. And you look up that rate on this new table to determine the interest rate that you will be using going forward. So the most recent version that I looked at, the current 12-year rate was about 2.5%. When I go to appendix of 4022, I see that 2.6% is less than 3.18. And so since it's less than 3.18, I would use a 0% annuity or interest rate in my annuity withdrawal calculations. Frankly, I don't understand, the methodology here. It's a way to get to the similar rate that has been used in the past. And I think this is probably the easiest method to use going forward until something, at least in the short term, until the negotiating parties decide whether or not a new interest rate is required. But again, it's a convoluted, it doesn't, there's not a whole lot of common sense used in coming up with the approach, but it is an option to use in the short term, especially while you determine whether or not additional steps need to be taken. So what are other possible replacement rates? One alternative could be treasury rates. For a long time, the 30-year treasury rate was the rate that was prescribed by the IRS to calculate lump sums in the private sector. So again, this is a rate that has been used to calculate lump sums in the past. So therefore, it does make sense that this could be an option. The current rate is 2.35%. That's down from, historically over the last 10 or 15 years, the average has probably been closer to 4 or 5, but 30-year treasury rates are a potential replacement if you decide that you need something other than the replacement rate that was recommended or at least offered by the PBGC. I know some funds have elected to go with the 10-year treasury rate as a replacement instead. That's 1.64. So if we just think about the impact on the members, if 2.35 or 1.64, we'd end up increasing the monthly reduction in their benefit $100 or so, $150 per month. It would reduce the subsidy that's being provided, but the members would have a steeper monthly reduction in, to their benefit amounts. Another potential option is the 417E approach that I mentioned previously. This is the prescribed rates for lump sums in the private sector. They use a yield curve approach, but they've simplified it a little bit. Rather than using those 200 rates that I mentioned earlier, they've simplified it down to 3 rates. For the first 5 years, you have to discount at the first segment rate, which is currently 0.69%. For the next 15 years, you have to discount at 2.92%. And everything beyond 20 years, you discount at 3.69%. So when you do it, the effective rate comes in, about between the second and third segment rate, about 3.25%. That's a rate I mentioned earlier. That is a complicated approach. I don't think to use a yield curve, even 3 segment rates in this case, just because it, like I said, it complicates it and makes it things even more difficult to understand than already are. So one potential option would be to simplify it and just let's say for a 50-year-old, most of the payments are going to be in the next 20 years. So let's just use segment rate. So that's 2.92% in this case. Sandy, you can still hear me, right?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I just got the dreaded "your internet is unstable" message, so I wanted to make sure I wasn't talking to myself.
No, I hear you.
So again, maybe just using the second segment rate would be an option. And beyond that, really any other index that the negotiated parties would like to use is something that can be used. Like I said, there's no limits on what you can use. It's just something that has to be agreed on by everybody. So I was limiting this to 45 minutes and then 15 minutes of potentially 15 minutes of questions. So I'll wrap up my comments here by stating a few conclusions. In most cases, some sort of action is needed by the funds or the pension boards in order to continue to effectively administer your plans. Without that PBGC rate being published, you need to have an alternative, whether it's just simply using the replacement rate that the PBGC has put forth or coming up with something else. Either way, you need to have this discussion to make sure that when we're doing benefit calculations during 2021 and beyond, the administrator, the actuary, everybody knows exactly what we need to be using, which interest rate needs to be used in doing those calculations. The second conclusion is the impact of the annuity withdrawal option has on the, we need to understand the impact that it has on the plan members and the plan funding. Providing this benefit at a 0% interest rate is going to require more contributions to the plan, whether they're being calculated or determined in your valuation or not. It simply is going to increase the total cost to the plan over time. And I think it has become obvious that over the last 45 minutes that the interest rate that's here is by far the most important factor. As I said at the very beginning, based on the memo that Sandy provided to me, this was a much different discussion back in the 80s being implemented. Interest rates were much higher. The PBGC rate was 8.7%, and this subsidy really wasn't an issue. As time has passed, as interest rates have fallen, it has created a discussion that needs, are we comfortable providing subsidies to the level that they are today? And if not, what do we need to do? What can be done from both a member perspective and a plan sponsor perspective to make sure that this isn't going to adversely affect your pension plan going forward? Because that's the last thing that we want is an interest rate that is much, much lower than where it used to be to negatively impact the benefits and affect those members who are either retired now or going to be retired in the future, affect the amount that they're going to receive from the pension plan. And so again, I think this is an important conversation to have. I don't think there's no right answer here. I think using 0% is fine. Using any rate in between, also works. It's just important that everybody is on the same page and understands where everybody's coming from. So with that, I will turn it over to Eric with any questions that have come up.
Jason, Sandy, thank you so much. Absolutely, we have questions. So the first question, couldn't the rate be used just be the assumed rate of return or the plan's rate of return?
Yes, that is an option. And in fact, we work with a number of plans in the state of Florida. In the state of Florida, they have this option where it's a little bit different because it's not necessarily their member contributions, but they are able to take a partial lump sum up to a quarter of their benefit in the form of a lump sum. And in those cases, we use that same interest rate. That's 7.5%. And so there is no subsidy that's being provided. So that definitely is an option to use that rate. One thing that I haven't mentioned that has come up a number of times is, if a member were to purchase service, the day before they retired, for example, I'm going to use an extreme example, and I don't know that this ever happens, but it's a possibility. But a member could buy service. Let's just say they pay $100,000, increase their benefit by $500 per month because of this additional service. Then the next day they get that $100,000 back, and their pension benefit goes down $400. So effectively, by giving $100,000 to the fund for one day, they could increase their pension benefit by $100 per month. When you're using different rates and you're allowed to purchase service, that's something that could happen. Like I said, it's a bit of an extreme example, but I obviously did that just to make the point. So if we were to use the same rate, we're using 7.35%. In the example I just gave you, there would be no benefit to doing that. You would give them $100,000, your benefit would go up $500. You withdraw the $100,000, your benefit would go down $500. So when there isn't that subsidy that's being provided, that would eliminate that possibility. But to answer the original question, the long-term rate of return assumption in your valuation is definitely one that could be used.
Okay, the next one, people are definitely paying attention. So this one says that if you set your segment rates to be used by age, and as in your example, you use the second segment for a 50-year-old and a different segment for someone else, aren't you opening yourself up for discrimination?
I think that's a very good point. I think that is a very astute observation. But when I'm talking about the segment rates, I'm talking about years from today. So for the first 5 years, it's they're not by age, but the point still remains that if I'm 55 and someone else is age 50, my payments from 55 to 60 would be discounted at the 0.69% assumption, meaning the 50-year-old, those same years would be discounted at 2.92%. So I think that is a very good comment. And that would be part of the reason why I wouldn't recommend using segment rates. If you go back to what I was saying, I think the second segment rate is representative of what the effective rate would be if you used all of the segment rates. But I would pick one rate, the second segment rate, and just avoid the using all three segments altogether, just to avoid complications as the questioner brought up.
And I suppose it's appropriate to insert here the appropriate disclaimers that this presentation is really working through the numbers and modeling, and that and these are important considerations, but any action really, whatever action or inaction the board takes should be discussed and boards are encouraged to consult their legal counsel and coordinate with the government. If there's separate counsel for the municipality, there may be some issues between the pension board and the municipality. So please don't just go by this and have a conversation, which leads to the next question. This is the first I'm hearing of this issue. When do we need to act?
The answer is going to vary by plan. So a lot of times, let's just say a calendar year plan. So someone that has a January 1 through December 31st plan year. Most often, that's the same period that they would use for their benefit calculations. In order to not disrupt, or so they can do benefit calculations in advance, most places would use a look back period to determine the interest rate. So my plan year is a calendar year. So calendar year 21 is when, the period I'm looking at, but I'm going to use the November 2020 PBGC rate. That gives me gives me 2 months to implement that rate. So if I have someone who's going to retire on January 1st, I can do that calculation in advance. If I'm using the January 1 rate, well, then, there might be a little bit of a delay in the benefit calculation, a little bit of a hiccup in the administration of the plan. So the timing really comes down to that. If you're a January 1 and you're using a November PBGC rate, well, there is no November 2020 PBGC rate. So you needed to take action sooner than today. Many plans are June 30th. And so plan year ends on June 30th. Those plans are facing that decision now, right? Because we're not to the end of their fiscal year yet. So we're still using the rate that was determined last summer. But once we get to the end of June, any new calculations that are done in July need to be based on that new rate. So having that new rate in place before the end of your fiscal year is really important. So, I guess that's a sort of a non-answer, but it really depends on the timing of the end of the year, which rates you've been using historically.
Okay. And so you had mentioned, I think a couple approaches you've mentioned are, sort of just a set flat rate, or sort of some type of adjustment based on some market or other benchmark. Just out of curiosity, from what you've been working with and who you've been consulting, is there are there more plans going one way as opposed to the other, or is it a toss-up?
Well, I would say at this point, another non-answer answer is to be determined.
Fair enough.
The most of the attorneys that I've seen, that I've worked with so far, have basically drawn up, I don't know, not necessarily, they've drawn up legal documents. I don't want to call it an ordinance, but they've drawn up legal documents that have said, we're going to use the recommended replacement rate that was put forth by the PBGC. That's the rate we're going to use in the short term. Meanwhile, since the board really is, it's an administrative board, right? They can't, they don't have the power to really select this rate. It's negotiated. It's the negotiating parties come to an agreement and say, this, pension board, this is the rate we're using. You need to administer it appropriately. So these decisions, this negotiation they don't happen overnight. And so the boards have adopted the approach put forth by the PBGC, the replacement rate put forth by the PBGC in the short, and will continue to use that unless the negotiating parties come up with a different. So that's where we are with most of our plans, is we're going to continue sort of business as usual, because replacement rate ratio, and Eric, you provided me with a spreadsheet, which I found to be really helpful, where you went back, 3 or 4 years, and the replacement ratio provides the same rate as the PBGC in the vast majority. Sometimes there's a 0.25% difference, but it's almost the same. So they're going to continue with that approach, which is sort of business as usual, and they're told to use another approach.
And great, and that, I think that's a great answer, and it's an important distinction, certainly for trustees to understand, is that some of this is based upon negotiations with the unions, to the extent that it's a board issue, but it also is a bigger issue, and that's why consultation is needed with the municipality, representatives, as well as their council, and from our personal experience in Farmington Hills, it took some time and it took a few meetings. So if these issues are out there, I just encourage the participants to start having discussions, but also make sure you leave enough time to work through this, because it's not a slam dunk easy decision. And there are a lot of different considerations that go into this. So
Yep. Eric, you're exactly right. And the approach that I described that has been taken in many places, really just a stopgap. It's okay, we need to continue to administer these benefits. Here's what we're going to keep everything this business as usual. Let's have a bigger discussion about whether fundamental changes need to be made, and if so, what are those changes? We'll negotiate it. We'll implement it down the road. But something has to be in place in order to make sure that people continue to receive their pension benefits as allowed for under the plan documents.
I want to be mindful of everyone's time as we're coming up on the hour, but we did get 2 more questions. Sandy and Jason, I know you may have been involved with other meetings. Actually, I know, Jason, you've been involved in other meetings during the day. Do you have time for a couple more?
Sure.
Okay, great. Thank you. And just as a reminder, this is being recorded. So for anyone who has a tight time commitment, come back and see the recording for the last few minutes. So if you are using the PBGC alternate scenario, who calculates the rate, right? So who's going to look at, first look at the Treasury notice with the rate, and then look at the appendix to see what that translates into?
I think that's whomever's doing your benefit calculations. I mean, I think that, if we do benefit calculations for a number of our clients as the actuary, we would look that up. Like I said, there's no real calculation involved, so it's not complicated. It's just knowing where to go, where to find the notices, where to find the appropriate tables. It's just, you're just really looking numbers up. So it's not complicated, but it just takes a little knowledge and where to go to find the information. But I think whoever is providing that or completing the calculation should be the one who's looking that up. And I think that's probably something that they should be sharing with the board, before doing the calculation, saying, hey, as agreed upon, we are going to be using 0% as our annuity withdrawal rate this year based on the methodology prescribed by the PBGC.
And then the last question is, I'm reading through it. It's less of an actuarial question, so I'll share with everyone that this issue, the rate, is not in our collective bargaining agreements. It's just set by the pension board. So the board could act unilaterally in this instance, right? I'm going to save our good friends who have informed us from any exposure. It sounds right, but this is where you definitely want to consult with the board's legal counsel, because and there may be other considerations, but it looks like the answer is yes, but we're not here to give advice, certainly legal advice or specific directions. And my sister-in-law is an actuary as well, and her tagline at the end of her email is, if you torture the numbers long enough, they'll tell you what you want to hear. So the actuaries focus on the numbers and the calculations, but not giving an answer specific to that.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. We've, in the cases where we've looked at this, there definitely are differences from one municipality to another. And, in every case that we've worked with, it's been negotiated, but it wouldn't surprise me at all. It doesn't surprise me at all to hear that there is at least an instance where the pension board has more control over this rate than others. So there are always individual circumstances that are going to dictate exactly how each fund and board needs to operate.
Okay, well, again, we want to thank Foster and Foster for being a corporate member of MAPERS, and for Jason and Sandy taking the time to put this together. And of course, we want to thank each and every one of you for joining us today. Just a quick update about the next few months. MAPERS is sponsoring 2 socially distanced outdoor networking events this summer. On Thursday, June 24th, we are hosting Tigers Night. It'll be at the Detroit Athletic Club and Comerica Park on Monday. And then on Monday, July 19th, we are hosting a golf outing at the Tam O'Shanter Country Club in West Bloomfield. Information for these events is posted on our website. Space is limited, so don't wait to sign up. Before the program began, I was advised that for the Tigers Night, we're about at 60% capacity. And then finally, we remain hopeful that we'll be able to host our fall conference in Bay City in September. We're continuing to monitor pandemic conditions as well as government rules, regulations, and changes as they happen. But whatever, if we do proceed, the conference will follow all group meeting guidelines set by the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. So please watch our website as well as your email for updates about the conference. On behalf of the MAPERS board, we wish you, your family, and your colleagues good health and safety, and enjoy the rest of your day.